Hi, I'm Sarah Delaney with Missouri Star. Thank you for joining me for our latest knitting tutorial. In this episode, we're going to be making the really adorable pinwheel baby blanket. This is a great pattern for adventurous beginners. So if you know how to knit and you know how to purl, but you're not quite sure how to put those two stitches together into anything really fun, this is a great way for you to explore that. We're going to start with a seed stitch border, and then we're going to move into a really easy to memorize stitch pattern just made out of knits and purls that creates this really lovely pinwheel texture that you can see in the blanket. Let's talk about supplies. We are using Aran Cashmereno Aran, which is a slightly heavy worsted weight yarn. It's a number 4 medium, and we just have these lovely soft pastel baby spring colors to use. So I'm going to be using this hollyhock color. That's what we made the sample in here. It's sort of a soft mauvey grayish pink, not too garish, just a really, really lovely, lovely pink color. You're going to need 4 skeins of the Aran Cashmereno Aran for this blanket. For the size that we're making, that's 36 by 36. But it's an easy enough pattern to make bigger and wider and longer. So you could pick up more skeins and just make a larger blanket if you want to. Additionally, our standard supplies, you'll need scissors, you'll need a tape measure, you will need stitch markers, and I'm using, because I'm just in a spring mood, I'm using these great stitch markers from Clover that sort of have a little curly Q flower shape to them. It just feels cute and springy. So, and I like the colors, the pink and the blue. We will need a tapestry needle to weave in our ends. I love these bent tip needles from Chibi. They're also from Clover. And you get 2 sizes in this set. There are 2 large-eyed needles and 1 smaller, but they all have a bent tip, which just makes weaving in your ends at the end of the project just that much easier. And for your knitting needle, I'm using Chagu needles with the red lace, and it's a circular knitting needle. Why am I using a circular knitting needle when this is a flat piece? Well, because this is a 36 by 36 inch blanket, you don't want to have to work it on straight needles, single point needles, because they're going to be so long, and just to get your stitches made, you'll be flapping your wings and your arms will be tired. So for wider projects like a blanket, we really recommend a circular needle, and you just treat it like 2 straight needles, but then the weight of the project as it grows rests down here on the cable between the needles instead of on the needles themselves, putting all that stress on your wrists and on your arms. So I'm using a 24-inch US size 10.5, and that is a 6.5 millimeter knitting needle. If you think you have one in your stash, but you're not sure, we also have our great Llama needle gauge, where you can check the size of your needle and make sure that what you have is a 10.5. And that is what I have. So 24-inch, 10.5 knitting needle. And those are our supplies. I'm also using a pattern keeper because there are charts in this pattern. It's also written out line by line, so you can just follow the written pattern. But if you, like me, enjoy a pattern in a more visual format, I'll get into that when we get to that part of the pattern. I'll show you the chart. I find it much easier to follow the chart than the line by line written instructions, but we include both, because there are knitters that like one and there are knitters that like the other. So let's get started. You're going to start with our standard cast on. It's a long tail cast on. And the pattern calls for you to cast on 132 stitches. Now, I'm going to cast on just a little bit so I can demonstrate this pattern to you. And let me show you that long tail cast on. So you can start with a slip knot on your needles, but I like to start with the yarn held in my hand in the slingshot that we use for long tail cast on. Let me show that to you again. So long tail cast on is because you need a long tail, because you're going to eat up that tail as you cast on these stitches. And then you make a loop and you open it up with your thumb and your forefinger, your pointer finger, and then you hold on to the tail on the working yarn. So essentially you've made a little slingshot. And then what I like to do is, instead of putting a slip knot on my needle, which leaves a knot at the bottom corner of my project, I like to just twist on my first stitch. So I'm going to put my needle on top of that little slingshot, bring it down, and just twist my needle over. See that? Now there's a stitch on my needle. I'll show that to you again. I just put my needle on top, push it down, bring it up and around. So that's one. And then to actually cast on stitches with the long tail, we're going to go under this outside strand here. So there's three, 1, 2, 3. See those strands? You're going to go under this outside strand. You're going to come over and catch the strand that's coming off of your pointer finger, and then push that down through the loop on your thumb, and then release with your thumb and pull up. And if you hold on to the yarn down here in your hand, it keeps everything in place. So let me show you that again. Under the outside, grab the pointer finger, push it down through the loop around your thumb, release your thumb, push your thumb back out, and you've cast on another stitch. We do have a stitch support video for this cast on if you need more time and support to learn how to do this cast on. But you can also use any cast on that you are comfortable with. If you have a particular cast on that you like, that you enjoy making, or that you don't struggle with, because you shouldn't struggle with your crafts, feel free to use that. There is no particular reason why you have to use the long tail cast on for this project. I just find it to be particularly easy. So go ahead and get your stitches cast on. Again, it's 132 stitches, and then meet me back here and we'll work row 1. So here I've cast on a few stitches. You will have considerably more stitches cast onto your needles, but I just have a little bit for demonstration purposes here. And I have a really long tail left over, which is fine. There's a couple ways you can deal with that. At the end of the project, you're really only going to need about 6 to 8 inches of this to weave in. So I could cut it short, but I have a particular thing that I do for myself, because this is like guaranteed a little extra yarn in case I end up playing yarn chicken at the end of a project. So I like to turn this tail into a little yarn butterfly. So I wrap this tail around 2 fingers until there's only about 3 inches left. And then I wrap that around the middle and then slip it through itself so it just stays put. And I have just a little yarn butterfly. If I need that yarn, I just pull on that little tail and it comes out. But it also helps me to not work with my tail when I begin knitting, because that is one of the pitfalls of knitting, is that once you've done your long tail cast on, your tail and your working yarn are at the same spot. And so when you go to work your first stitch, if you're not really careful, you can end up grabbing your tail instead of your working yarn. And this helps to keep me from doing that. So now I'm ready to work row 1 of the blanket. And we are working in seed stitch, which is knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and then the opposite on the other side. So it creates this really wonderful texture. Let me bring this in so you can see it. That's seed stitch here along the edge. It's alternating rows of knits and purls, and it is just one of the most beautiful textures in knitting. We just love it. And it makes a great border. So that's what we're going to start with. So row 1, I'm just going to move my yarn over here because that's where it's going to come from for me. I'm going to snug my stitches up towards the tip of my needle a little bit. So now I'm ready to knit row 1. And we're going to start knit 1, purl 1. Knit 1, purl 1. And you're going to repeat that all the way across. Knit 1, purl 1. until you reach the other side of your work. Go ahead and work that first full row and meet me back here for row 2. So that's the end of row 1. If we look at it here, you can see all those little purl bumps. Isn't that great? So for row 2, we're going to do the opposite of what we did in row 1. We're going to start with a purl 1, then a knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 all the way across. For me, my brain doesn't think in terms of knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 when I'm working in a seed stitch pattern. Once I've set up that first row, for every row that I need to work in the seed stitch pattern, I remember to do the opposite of what I see in my knitting. So this is a great pattern for you to learn to read your knitting, which is so helpful as you move on through your knitting adventure. So when I'm looking at that first row that we did, it's always easiest to see those purl bumps because they're across your work. They're really easy to see. So that's a purl. So I know that on each side of that was a knit. I'm going to do the opposite of what I see, which is if that first one was a knit, I'm going to purl it. Oop. Then that second stitch is a purl stitch. So I'm going to knit it and just continue that way across this row. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 until you get to the end of the row and you're ready to start row 3. So there I've finished row 2, and it's hard to see at this point, but the seed stitch is starting to build. But I thought I'd bring in my pattern keeper at this point and show you the chart. So here you can see there's the instructions for the seed stitch. Row 1, knit 1, purl 1, repeat to the end. Row 2, purl the knit stitches, knit the purl stitches. So that's purl 1, knit 1 to the end. And then there's also the chart here. And in your pattern, you'll have 2 charts, one for the seed stitch pattern and one for the pinwheel pattern, which we'll get to shortly. And then there's a key for that, and it tells you what these symbols mean. So an open box is a knit stitch, a box with the dot in it is a purl stitch, and it's worked from right to left because we're working this flat. Every time we turn the work over to begin the next row, our stitches are working from the right to the left. So our chart is read from the right to the left, and that's just that 2-row repeat. And we repeat that for 8 rows. So we're going to repeat that chart 4 times. We've done 2 rows here. I'm going to start row 3, which starts with a knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Then when you get to row 4, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and then you just repeat those 2 rows until you have 8 rows of seed stitch. And then meet me back here and we'll move into the pinwheel pattern. Once you've got your 8 rows of seed stitch done, it'll look a little bit like this. Although yours will be considerably wider since I'm just working on a small swatch. From here, we're going to move into the pinwheel pattern. So we're going to place these stitch markers because the seed stitch border that we built here at the bottom of the blanket is going to continue up both sides of the blanket. So we need something to remind us to keep those stitches on the sides in seed stitch and then the stitches in the middle in our pinwheel pattern. And so we use our stitch markers for that. What we're going to do is place our first stitch marker after the 6th stitch on our needles, and the second one before the last 6 stitches on our needles. Now you can certainly place these stitch markers as you're working the last row of the bottom seed stitch border, but it's so easy to put them on this way that I just do that. The other thing that you may want to do is to take a stitch marker and place it on the front of your work here to remind you that this is the right side of your work. And so if you're looking at your piece and that stitch marker is here in the fabric, you know that you're looking at the right side. But if you're looking at this side of the work and you don't see the stitch marker, you know that you're looking at the wrong side, because there is a right side and a wrong side of the blanket, even though they are 100% reversible. It's good to know what the right side and the wrong side is within your pattern. So if you're a little bit confused about what row you're on, that's one way to help center you okay, now I'm on my yarn is to the right side stitch marker is facing me. It's easier to find your place in the pattern if you know those two things. So we worked 8 rows in seed stitch. We're going to continue these first 6 stitches in seed stitch. So I'm doing the opposite of what I see. I see a purl one. I'm going to knit one. I see a knit one. I'm going to purl one. I'm going to continue knit one, purl one until I get to that stitch marker. Just those 6 stitches. I get to that stitch marker. I just slip that stitch marker over to the other needle because I want it to stay in place, keeping those 6 stitches separate. But now I'm going to move into the body of the blanket and we're going to work that pinwheel pattern. Now, let me bring in my pattern keeper again so that you can see the chart. It's 22 rows for the pinwheel pattern. And again, that's all written out for you row by row what to do, but there's also this lovely chart. Similar to the seed stitch chart that we looked at before, you can see the row numbers on either side. This is worked from right to left, but where the row number is, you're then going to work that from left to right. If the number is over here, right to left. If it's here, left to right, because you turn your work over when you work a row. And these are knit stitches with the dots. They're purl stitches. So the first row of our pinwheel pattern, we're going to knit 10 and then we're going to purl 10. So let's go ahead and do that. Easy enough, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then we're going to purl 10. Bring our yarn to the front and purl 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now you will have a considerable amount of stitches left. You'll have over 100 stitches left to go on your blanket, and you'll just keep repeating that. 10 knit stitches, 10 purl stitches, 10 knit stitches, 10 purl stitches until you get to that second stitch marker, which is where you transition back to your seed stitch. So we'll go ahead and slip that stitch marker and we're going to do the opposite of what we see. So I see a purl stitch, I'm going to knit one, and I see a knit stitch, I'm going to purl one and continue to the end. Knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. I'm going to turn this over for the second row of our pinwheel section. I'm going to continue the seed stitch on these outer 6 stitches, doing the opposite of what I see. That's a knit stitch, so I'm going to purl it, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, slip that stitch marker, and then let's go back to our chart for a minute. So this is one of the great things about the chart keeper is this big magnetic bar at the bottom. I can move that up and cover the row that we just knit so that the row just above the magnet is what I need to work next. And this one starts with a knit stitch and then moves into purl stitches. Or does it? Let's talk about that for a minute. Because if I were to follow that, then I would break up the pattern that I'm beginning to create. Let me show you this here. Because we're on the wrong side of the work now, when I did all those purl stitches, they're knit stitches now. And where I did all of my knit stitches, they're purl stitches. So when you're working on the wrong side of the work, when you're working from left to right on your chart, those stitch symbols are reversed. So if it's an open square, you're actually going to purl it. And if it's a square with a dot in it, you're actually going to knit it. So again, this is detailed in your pattern and in the key. It's also written out for you in the written portion of the pattern. So if the chart feels confusing to you, you can read the written part of the pattern. And that says to purl 1, knit 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then purl 9 and knit 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, knit 1. You will repeat that across the width of your blanket until you get to that second stitch marker. You'll slip that stitch marker and then you'll work your seed stitch doing the opposite of what you see. And it's really that simple. So again, there are 22 rows in the pinwheel pattern. You'll follow those as written or as charted, keeping these 6 stitches on each side in seed stitch, and then working your pinwheel pattern across the middle. Once you've worked those 22 rows, you just start over again and you repeat them as many times as the pattern calls for you to repeat them. Once you have worked the number of pinwheel repeats that the pattern calls for, you're going to go back to working seed stitch all the way across for 8 rows before binding off. Let me just get to the end of this row 3 here, and then I will walk you through binding off just as a quick refresher. Let's see, back to my seed stitch border. That's the end of row 3 for me, but let's pretend this is the end of the blanket for me. I've worked all of my pinwheel repeats. I have worked my final seed stitch border, my final 8 rows of seed stitch, and I'm ready to bind off. We're going to do the simplest bind off there is, where we knit 2 stitches. Then we go back to the first stitch and we lift it up and over and off, just like that. We knit 1 more stitch and then we lift up and over and off. And you just do that all the way across. You want to be mindful that these stitches should be very loose because if you bind off tightly, you're going to have a very tight edge, and your cast on edge isn't very tight. So you almost want to be looser than you think you can control, almost to the point where you're like, this stitch is not going to stay on this needle, but it will. It will. And then you're just going to bind off all the way across until you've bound off all of your stitches. Go ahead and do your bind off all the way across, and then meet me back here and we'll talk about weaving in ends and blocking. Once you've finished all of the knitting on your blanket, there are 2 very important things that you're going to want to do. One is weaving in your ends. And that is as simple as taking the tail from the beginning and the tail from the end and burying that in your work so that it disappears and it doesn't pop back out. And while that sounds like it might be a little bit difficult, it's actually pretty simple. So you're going to take one of your tapestry needles, thread your yarn into that. And then I've left this stitch marker in here so that I know that this is the right side. So I'm going to go to the wrong side of the work, and I'm going to see if I can follow 1 strand of yarn down into my knitting. And just follow it wherever it wants to go. I'm just following this 1 strand of yarn, and then it comes back up here, and then back down through here, just making that yarn disappear into the fabric of my knitting. I'm going to go through 1 more set of stitches, and then on this one, instead of just going underneath this purl bump, I'm actually going to pierce this purl bump. So I'm coming through the plies of the yarn. That puts a little extra tension on the end of the yarn that helps to hold it in place, and I'm going to snip it pretty close and then that's it. That end is woven in. I would do the same thing with my tail. So this is one of the reasons why I do that little butterfly. I can just pull it out. I can snip it 6 to 8 inches. I can thread my tapestry needle and I can weave this in. Now, the one last thing that you're going to want to do with your project is you're going to want to block your project. Depending on what yarn you use, you may not need to block your project. If you've used a 100% acrylic yarn, you don't necessarily have to block it. 100% acrylic yarn doesn't block very well. Blocking is sort of teaching your yarn its new shape, because your yarn right now thinks that this is its shape. It thinks that it lives in big loopy loops that create a ball or a skein. And you've just taken all of that yarn and crammed it into little tiny interlocking kinks. But it still thinks that this is its shape. So with natural fibers, with wool, or with cotton, or alpaca, or linen, you sort of have to help your yarn settle into its new shape. And the LRA Cashmereno Aran is super wash wool and a little bit of cashmere for extra softness. And so when your blanket is finished, gosh, look at that. It's so sweet. It's so cute. I just want to cozy up under it, find a baby to wrap in it. You're going to want to block your blanket. And for natural fibers, there are 2 options. You can steam block or you can wet block. And this is not a super wash merino, so I don't necessarily recommend machine washing it. If you're going to hand wash it, that's fine. So you can steam block this. So I would take my blocking boards back there, my puzzle pieces, put them together in a square big enough to be larger than this blanket, and then just pin out the edges to hold it in place, and then use your fabric steamer. Run your fabric steamer over the blanket, and then just let it sit until it's cool. And then it's done, and it's ready to gift for that lovely new baby in your life. So I hope you have enjoyed the Pinwheel baby blanket tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed learning just how easy it is to create this beautiful texture. Know that you can do it in lots of different yarns. I have a couple of samples here. This is our Hayfield Baby Blossom. It's that same pinwheel pattern that we just made. This is the Cashmereno Aran with a pom-pom yarn carried along with it for this really bright confetti color, and just another color of worsted weight yarn. So any worsted weight yarn will work in this pattern to create those lovely pinwheels. So this is a pattern you can use over and over again for every new baby that pops up in your life. Thank you for joining me for this latest knitting tutorial. Don't forget that you can visit the link below to pick up all of the supplies or the kit for this pattern. And I will see you the next time we knit. Happy knitting. Thanks so much for stitching along with us on this Missouri Star yarn loving tutorial. If you haven't yet, you want to click that bell and subscribe and become part of the Missouri Star family and make sure that you never miss another tutorial. You never know, you might make your next favorite project.